It's halfway through the year and I have somehow read 70 books. So I figured it would be fun to go through some of the highlights and the lowlights of my reading this year, as well as some of my goals for the latter half of the year. I think this channel has really inspired my reading and inspired me to read a bit more widely. So as always, this is going to be a mix of literary fiction as well as some genre work and trying to read international as well. So hopefully you can get some reading recommendations from this as well, and hopefully I can too. So as always, please feel free to put your own recommendations and comments about what you've been reading in the comments, because I always want to expand my reading list. But yeah, let's get into this list of some of the highs, lows, big, small, and some of the surprises of the reading year so far. And as always, if you want to follow along in real time, I have a book blog which I recently moved to Substack, which I try to update at least every other week with 4 new reads. So follow along there. But let's get into these books. Let's start with the longest book that I read this year, which is actually Anne Rice's The Witching Hour, which I read as part of my horror book club. I think it's about 1,100 pages, and honestly, I loved it. I haven't read any Anne Rice since I was in high school and I read her vampire novels, and this is just full Southern Gothic, really lush description, obviously with 1,100 pages, and it's a multi-generational story about a family and witches and a spirit called Lasher that sort of haunts them. And Rice just goes full in. There's a lot of weird sexual stuff, a lot of just interesting themes about family and violence. And as someone who reads a lot of horror and just really likes when the writing is really good, I enjoyed the campiness and just how much Anne Rice wallows in this. I picked up the second book in this series. It's a trilogy called Lasher, which I'm looking forward to reading in the latter part of the year. But yeah, if you just really want a deep dive into disturbing New Orleans Southern Gothic, which is going to stick with you, this is a really good bet and just shows the power that Rice has as a writer. And I might have to revisit some of her vampire novels just because I haven't read a lot of really lush horror fiction in a while, and this was a great reminder of Anne Rice as a master. The second longest novel that I read was The Bee Sting by Paul Murray, but I don't really want to talk about that. I did a whole video on it, so I'm going to skip to the third one, which is José Donoso's The Obscene Bird of Night, which I was really looking forward to. He's a seminal Chilean author. I picked this up in Spanish, and it is a really weird book. It basically follows a bunch of characters. The perspective shifts so that the main narrator inhabits himself a nun, a weird mask. There's some odd, disturbing elements. It takes place in sort of a nun's cloister, and there is a deformed child. It, of course, goes back to some of the myths in Chile and Argentina about the embunche, which is a really rich vein for a lot of horror. It is supposed to be sort of a dark magical realism, and I enjoyed it quite a bit, but I think because I was spoiled by Carlos Fuentes' Terra Nostra, which is one of the most grand and disturbing and inventive of these sorts of magical realist novels, I was a bit disappointed in it, but it's still like a really good, interesting read and really helped me bone up on my Spanish. But if you want to pick up some Donoso, this is a good one to start with, and of course I'll keep recommending Fuentes, but not as disturbing as I had thought. But let's move out of the really disturbing things and get into some of the really fascinating short fiction that I read this year. The shortest book I read this year was actually my introduction to the Nobel Prize winner Annie Ernaux, and it was Passion Simple, or Simple Passion, which I read in French. I'm trilingual. It's one of the benefits of doing a modern languages degree, and it's nice to not read in translation every once in a while, and I absolutely loved this. Ernaux is an incredible writer. I think even in translation people have told me, but just her French is so specific and transporting. This basically tells the story of her having a love affair in middle age with an older man, and it's just a beautiful encapsulation of an all-consuming passion and everything that you just do, and we're in the midst of a love affair if you're just absolutely obsessed with someone. I love this book, and it made me recommend The Years, which is her seminal book, which basically encapsulates her whole life and the shifts in France over her lifetime, to my book club. I enjoyed that quite a bit, but Passion Simple still remains the peak for me, and I will probably pick up another one of her books this year. But if you want a short, incredible book, she won the Nobel Prize for a reason. This is really, really good. Also a Nobel Prize winner, and the second shortest book I read was Alice at the Fire by Jon Fosse, which has a really wonderfully dreamlike narration. It basically follows multiple generations of a family in a rural area, and there is shipwrecks and loss at sea. Everyone has names after the grandfather and mother. There's Elsa and Alice, and I just found it a really wonderful encapsulation of a place and a family where you've stayed in the same place for generations. And yeah, I can see that the style that Fosse uses can be a bit divisive, but I really enjoyed it for this specific purpose. I have to pick up Septology, which is his magnum opus. I might do that this year later, but for this short novella, I really liked the style and the way that it really incorporated the themes of shifting timelines and generations. We're not really sure which timeline you're in because everything sort of blends together. The most disappointing book that I read this year was The Sympathizer, which I had really high hopes for, and it started out really good. It basically follows a North Vietnamese double Asian. He embeds with the South and then has to flee the fall of Saigon to America, and all of that is really good, but you start to realize that the author doesn't really know what he wants to say. It starts to fall apart when it gets into this sort of Hollywood pastiche, and by the time it gets to the conclusion and there's this weird double think, you realize that the revelation that he's working towards isn't any sort of revelation. He doesn't have a larger point, but he's trying really hard to make one. And for that, I just found this really disappointing because it had so much potential and because the writing could be fun at times, but it just started to fall apart and then fell apart completely for me. So that was not a good one for me, but there were some good surprises this year. One was Percival Everett's James, which is the third Everett novel that I've read, and the first one that I've actually really liked. I found the trees to be a bit too messy and didn't really understand what it was doing, and then Erasure didn't go far enough into the satire. I mentioned this when I was talking about the top books of the 21st century, and so it just didn't really work for me, but I found James to be very nice and controlled, and I think it was because it was controlled by the Huck Finn story, which it is satirizing, and an adventure story is a great way to structure a novel, and I think it provided some structure for Everett to really give it his all. It still wasn't my favorite book, but it goes to a really solid ending, dark and twisty that you come to expect, and it is a nice controlled novel, so I did enjoy that. Another big surprise was Sister Souljah's The Coldest Winter Ever, which my fiance actually picked up from the library, and I enjoyed quite a bit. It is one of the products of that sort of 90s earnestness and the break of street literature. Sort of feels New Jack City in that vibe, but it basically follows Winter, who is, of course, the eponymous character who gets involved with street culture and throws her life away. But I just found it earnest and interesting, sort of soap opera and melodramatic, and I actually enjoyed it quite a bit. So if you want one of those books that's just entertaining and interesting and has a solid message, it's a bit long, but I actually really enjoyed this book much more than I thought it would. A quick break from fiction and into some poetry. I haven't read really much of any poetry this year, but I did read some Nikki Giovanni, who passed away either the end of last year or the beginning of this year. So I picked up her books and I really enjoyed her poetry. It's very accessible. I picked up two, Quilting the Black-Eyed Pea and something about rain. I can't quite remember the title, but if you check my book blog, it is there. And I just enjoyed its very direct poetry. A bit of it is sometimes can be a bit cringy Obama era, but I think a lot of the messages are still good. There's a lot of wit and humor and just kindness and humanity to her poems. They're very accessible, they're very nice, and I really enjoyed my time with Nikki Giovanni, and it sort of satisfied me with poetry for a while, but I definitely have to pick up more poetry books, which will be one of my goals for the latter half of the year. Graphic novels too, I've been in a bit of a drought. I've only read one, and it was picking up Charles Burns' The Final Cut. He did Black Hole, which is one of my favorite graphic novels. It's this very dark and interesting coming of age story about teenagers where there's a sexually transmitted disease which mutates you. And this is a lot more of a gentle story, but it's also in full color, and it's basically a reminiscence of filmmaking and again a coming of age story, but he has improved somehow even more as an artist, and just some of the drawings in this are incredible. The story is nice and pleasant and interesting, not as much to sink your teeth into as Black Hole, but I really enjoyed this. There's a lot to revisit, and just the art style is incredible. So if you haven't picked it up, any Burns, pick up either of those. They're both beautiful in their own ways. The oldest book that I've read so far this year is Leo Tolstoy's The Death of Ivan Ilyich. It's a book that I reread, but I, again, just really enjoyed it. It basically follows a wasted life and a religious conversion at the end. It's a really existentialist novel which contemplates a lot of things about the meaning of life and religion, and parallels a lot of Tolstoy's own philosophy. I really enjoyed this, and honestly, I know the novel Stoners had a lot of hype around it recently, and I read it, I think, last year. And this is everything that Stoner's trying to be. I wasn't a huge fan of Stoner because essentially it feels a lot more contrived and cold, and its treatment of women is really weird, especially Stoner's wife. But I think even Ilyich is sort of the quintessential of these sorts of wasted life novels, and you should just read it for the first time. It's just a really good book. The newest book that I've read so far this year is new in translation. It's Han Kang's We Do Not Part, which is a middling Han Kang for me. I liked it more than The Vegetarian, but not nearly as much as Human Acts, which I consider a masterpiece. This one, the first half really had me. Again, like a lot of Kang, it explores South Korean society. In this case, it was a massacre of suspected communists on Jeju in the post-war period. And the first half is this really odd dreamlike where the narrator is taking care of her friends who is injured and goes into a snowstorm, try to get to the island to take care of some pets. And then the latter half switches to a bit more of a didactic thing where it's just more lecturing you about the massacres that happened and the consequences of that. So I liked it less as it moved into more of a realist vein, but I think with everything that Kang does, there's a lot of interest here and a lot of interesting writing, but I wish it had kept the magic of the first half. All right, those were some fun categories, but let's get into some of the best books that I've read so far this year, my favorite, and some of the worst books that I read. But starting with the best, and one of the first books that I actually read this year, which is an older Ghanaian independence novel called The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born, which is a wonderful encapsulation of the disappointment of liberation and the experience of corruption. It follows a main narrator who is a clerk, and honestly, the writing is so beautiful. There is a lot of toilet metaphors and corruption, but it is so beautifully written that you just spend your time wading through the filth joyfully. It's a really wonderful celebration of language and just encapsulates so much of these sort of post-independence novels, but I think is just so well done and interesting. It's hard to find, but I was really, really happy. My fiance actually got me a copy for Christmas, and an incredible, beautiful book. And if you haven't picked it up, please do. It's one of the seminal works of post-independence literature, and the writing is absolutely some of the best that I have experienced. The worst book that I've read this year is actually the fault of Canada Reads, and it's a very generic thriller called Watch Out for Her. And every year I try to read the 5 shortlisted books for Canada Reads, which is a national reading competition which celebrates CanLit. And this is just a story told in 2 parts, where it's got a babysitter and a mom, and there's a deep secret between them, and it sort of comes to a head. And it's just very generic. The characters make no sense. The babysitter's motivations are just very silly, and it just feels very rote by the book and did absolutely nothing for me. It just felt very recycled and not at all what you're looking for in a thriller. But I'm not here just to bash CanLit. One of my favorite books so far this year has been Falling Hour, which is by a Scottish writer who actually moved here to Toronto, and this is his first novel, and it takes place, it's an artist who is lost in a park, and he's just contemplating his life in these beautiful meandering paragraphs over 24 hours. It's just a really beautiful contemplation of life. I absolutely adored this book, and I'm really looking forward. I think he has a book coming out next year. I'm really looking forward to following this author, just because this was a great debut, and I think he's a poet before, because you can just tell the language is so lush and wonderful, and it doesn't bore you at all, despite it being a bit of a meandering book. You really love to get lost with the narrator. Finally, the best nonfiction that I've read so far this year is Arundhati Roy's The Architecture of Modern Empire, which is a series of interviews she did with David Barsamian, follows from about 2001 to the mid-2010s, and it follows basically how right she is for many, many years, from her critique of the Iraq War all the way to the rise of Modi and Hindu nationalism. And it's really depressing because every problem she points out has gotten so much worse, from disinformation to the rise of nationalism and empire and just the horrors of everything. But it's just really reminds me of how great she is as a thinker and as a writer. I really, really love her work. Her essays are really good, as well as her recent fiction novel, which was one of my top 10 books, I think last year or the year before, if you watch my videos there. So yeah, just a great reminder of Roy as just one of our treasured writers. We need to protect her, and hopefully she can be wrong at some point, because yeah, things have not gone well past all of those interviews as well. So that's a fun little highlights and lowlights of the first half of the year. As to what I'm looking forward to reading through the latter half of the year, you'll notice that I did not include any short story collections, and so that is something that I really need to remedy. And of course, my fiance to the rescue, who's also a reader, less of a talker, which is why she is not in any of these videos, but she recommended Eden Robinson's Traplines, which I'll probably be reading in the next few weeks, so take a look out for that on the book blog, as well as some more poetry. So if you have any short story poetry recommendations, please leave them in the comments. I really need them. This is also the year that I said I would be reading some more Clarice Lispector, so I'm definitely going to read at least one, hopefully two, of her novels this year. Agua Viva, I think, is the shortest on the short list this year. And I'm going to try to overtake as well the longest book that I've read so far this year and try to get through Miss Mackintosh, My Darling, which I've seen a few people talk about. I think it might be getting a bit of a revival, but that's 1,200 pages, and apparently the language is exquisite, so really looking forward to that. But yeah, what are you really excited to read this year? Are there any really big highlights for you? Please let me know down in the comments, because I need some more books. I'm really plowing through these books this year, and I think it's partly inspired by the channels and engagement that I've gotten from people here on YouTube. So thanks as always for liking, subscribing, engaging, and talking about books with me. Just I found this to be really rewarding. And yeah, I will talk to you soon. I might have one more video in me before I get married and go on honeymoon and disappear for a few weeks. So stay tuned for that. It might be some themed book recommendations, because hey, I'm in a good mood, so I might just recommend some nice books to read as everything falls apart, because hey, life is good so far for me. It's been great for me this year. So many good books, such a good time, and thanks as always. I will talk to you soon, and let's keep celebrating literature in all its many forms.